morning. Welcome to the worship service at Restore Christian Church. For those of you who are visiting this morning, who are relatively new to this community, Restore is a church plant, meaning it's something totally new, something totally different. We're a church plant under the influence of an organization called Ignite, who for decades has planted churches throughout the Chicagoland area. Interestingly enough, though, we are their first church plant to be in Illinois, but not be in Chicago. I like to tell people that Allison and I, my wife Allison and I, are just kind of their guinea pigs. All right, but it's exciting. It really is. It's exciting for us to be here, and it's exciting for them as well to branch out from some of the communities and cultures that they're used to. But what this means is that I'm not only a pastor at Restore, but I'm also a church planter with Ignite, meaning in some ways I find my employment in both places. The way this works is I oversee Restore, and Ignite oversees me. They keep me accountable, supply me with resources and training and pretty much anything else that you can think of that's needed, direction. And they even, right off the bat, set Allison and I up with our own personal mentors. My mentor just so happens to be the executive director of Ignite, my boss and friend, Lance Hurley. I say boss because that's really what he is, and friend because that's what he's become. In a biblical sense, if I'm Timothy, Lance is Paul. And like Paul with Timothy, somehow Lance too has figured out a way to be my boss, my coworker, my friend, my leader, my mentor, all wrapped up into one. Lance has taught me a lot over the last 2 years that we've worked together about what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a man of God, what it means to be a husband. And I will always be grateful for the lessons he has taught me and the opportunities that he has given me, especially the opportunity that he has blessed me with to be here with all of you. However, out of all that I've learned from him, nothing has influenced me more, nothing has changed me more than his views and his example of prayer. Lance is a man of prayer. He truly is, who strives to live a life of total dependence on God, whose example has changed my life, and I'm sure the lives of countless others. Not that he's without fault. But what's inspiring is how disciplined he is in this particular area. As I was writing this, I came to the realization that there hasn't been one conversation I've had with Lance where we haven't ended it in a time of prayer. Even after writing this, he called me and wanted to check on me. And guess what he did at the end of our conversation? He prayed with me. Because of Lance, prayer is central to everything Ignite does. It precedes and follows every decision they make, and has even become a weekly practice of worship, as every single Wednesday morning, the organization invites anybody in association with them, all the staff, to get on a prayer call and have a small devotion and prayer together every single week. It might seem crazy, but Lance's first response to any situation, whether positive or negative, it's always prayer, as it should be. He once told me a story about a time he went to a church in the midst of some turmoil. Not knowing what to do or who to turn to, they called Lance and asked him to come down to their church, evaluate their situation, and kind of give them some advice of what to do. So Lance went, sat in the room with the leaders, and began to listen to some of the issues and some of the failed attempts they had made at resolving those issues. After they had shared for some time, Lance said he realized not one person had prayed before or during their meeting, nor was prayer in any of their ministry processes to make decisions or to resolve issues. There was no prayer involved at all. So Lance, being the man of prayer that he is, when asked, "What are we supposed to do?" said, "Well, I know one thing you can do. You can start praying. Lance said it was obvious that many of the leaders of the church were taken back by this response. And one of the guys even piped up and said, well, yeah, of course we can pray, but what else can I do? Give me something tangible. Give me something that I can accomplish. Lance said without a second thought, with a little bit of frustration, he said, like I said, you can pray. You can pray. You see, I believe a lot of us are like that well-intentioned but foolish man when it comes to our understanding and practice of prayer. For whatever reason, we've come to believe that prayer is something that has little to no value. We see prayer as nothing but wishful thinking, words without power, a last resort when all other practices have failed. When prayer is the greatest thing we can do. The Bible makes it clear that prayer is not only important and should be encouraged, but that the continual, lifelong practice of prayer is to be central and essential in the life of every follower of Christ. Prayer is time talking with God. If you're taking notes today, that's one thing I want you to write down. Prayer is time talking with God. It is literally that simple. It builds our relationship with Him. It's our most direct and our greatest avenue to God. It pleases Him. It reveals faith, produces trust, brings clarity and direction and correction and forgiveness and blessing, and you can continue on. It makes certain we know and are functioning within God's will. Prayer bestows much needed power, making all things possible. It's the one thing we must always be doing and need the most. Which leads me to the purpose of this study, which is simple. I want to inspire you to be praying. I want to stress the importance of taking time to talk with God. If you've never prayed before, if prayer is something that is scarce or rare in your life, this message today is going to challenge you to start. And if you're already praying on a regular basis, you're going to be challenged to be all the more intentional with that time. See, at Restore, one of our core values is to be passionate about prayer. We believe that a devout and active prayer life is essential, not only for a relationship with God to exist, but in everything that we do. As the Apostle Paul reminded the Ephesians, we are to pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. We are to devote ourselves to prayer, praying continually, as it says in the book of Thessalonians, without ceasing. More than anything, we need to set aside time to be in the presence of God. Do you hear me? More than anything. I always hear this. I don't have time. You do. More than anything, we need to set aside time to be in the presence of God. We need to talk with Him. We need to be praying, church. Amen? Today we're going to be continuing on to part 2 of our 6-part series entitled Spiritual Disciplines, where each week we discuss a different discipline or Christ-like practice. Habits or experiences designed to develop, grow, and strengthen certain internal qualities. As I mentioned before, over the course of this series, we're going to learn how, as Paul challenged Timothy, to train in godliness. Last week we discussed generosity. This morning we're discussing prayer. And in the weeks to come we're going to discuss fasting, worship, rest, and study. All very important practices I know we, including myself, and I'm going to say this every single week, including myself, can do better in. But as we turn to the Word of God to more deeply understand the practice and discipline of prayer, I've selected a story from the life of the prophet Daniel found in the book of Daniel to be our example for this morning. You see, at this point in the biblical narrative, where we're picking up in our reading, Daniel had reached his 70s. After having witnessed the destruction of the temple, being carried off into exile by the Babylonians at the age of approximately 17, it didn't take long for his captors to see promise in him and give him opportunity. God was with Daniel. He preserved his life and turned this orphan slave into one of the greatest prophets, a chief magi, kingly advisor, and political leader who would serve under both the Babylonian and Persian empires. What's amazing about Daniel is that even when kings died and empires crumbled, this man of God remained as a missionary and faithful example to all he encountered. However, his unwavering devotion to God and country wasn't always appreciated as it should have been. Throughout his life, mainly due to jealousy, as we'll see today, Daniel's faith had been put to the test and his life put in danger on many occasions. Even at 70 years old, there were those who sought to dispose of him and put an end to him by tossing him into a den full of lions. So with that being said, let's go ahead and begin in our passage for today. It's going to be Daniel chapter 6. So Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 28. And Scripture states, starting in verse 1, chapter 6, it pleased Darius, who was the emperor of the Persian Empire at the time, to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." And so what we see here, and this is why I said Daniel was not only devout when it came to his relationship with God, but also to the emperor, to the king, to the country. Daniel is now, by the time the Persians have defeated, it's amazing, the Persians come in, defeat the Babylonians, and they keep Daniel around. So obviously he's somebody special. It says there's a spirit in him. There's something about him that's attractive, that stands out amongst all others. It's his faith. It's the Holy Spirit that is within him. It's God's Spirit that other people are seeing. And sometimes people don't necessarily understand that or recognize that, but they can see that something special about Daniel. And wherever Daniel is, there seems to be blessing. So the king selects these 120 guys to survey and essentially function as governors over different parts of the empire. And over these 120 guys, there are 3 high officials. Daniel's one of them. And now the king is about to elect Daniel to be over even those 2. It's going to be Darius, Daniel, 2 guys, and everybody else. And that's going to be the hierarchy. And some of the other guys are really jealous. This old man shouldn't be in here. He doesn't know what he's doing. How fair is that? So they're trying to find a way to frame Daniel. They're trying to find a way to get him out so they can get in. They want his job. They want his position. They want his prestige. They want everything that comes with leadership in the Persian Empire. And Daniel's pretty much got it. So they try to find something in his life that can say, oh, this Daniel isn't as great as what everybody says he is. But they can't find anything. So they go, in what way can we trip him up? In what way can we get Daniel in trouble? Because he hasn't gotten in trouble for the last 70 years. We got to try something a little different. And they said, you know what we can do? We can trip him up when it comes to his relationship with God. The only thing that supersedes his devotion to Darius is his relationship with Yahweh, his relationship with God. And if we cause conflict within that, then we can get him in trouble. And so they come up with this scheme in verse 6, and it says, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. Gotta love suck-ups. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, all agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So what they do is they play on his ego. What we know historically is that King Darius is a very young man at this point. He just came to power. So he's trying to make a name for himself. He's trying to prove himself and his own authority. And what better way than doing what all the other pagan kings did, what the Egyptians started, and that was deifying the leader. It's not that necessarily Darius thought he was a god, but it was okay for him, but people thought he was. And so he's like, okay, we can do this. And so he's like, okay, it's only 30 days. 30 days, no one can pray to their God. No one can go to anybody else for religious help except me. Now, one thing that's kind of funny, and we read over it really quickly, but there's this reference to a den of lions. And that always kind of makes me laugh. It's like, who has a den of lions in the middle of Persia? Okay? And so what was common at this time was lion hunting. It's kind of like fox hunting, except a lot more exciting. And so what they would do is they would send people out, they would collect lions from different regions of Africa, they would bring them back, they would have them in this den, so that when, their friends and their other high king buddies would come over, they'd be like, you guys want to hunt some lion? Because that sounds pretty cool, right? And so it was like, defeating the king of the jungle, defeating the most powerful, mighty beast on earth. And so that was the idea. And so you have, a lot of kings had dens filled with lions, just, having lions stocked up whenever you needed one. So that's what's going on here. So there's this den, okay? And it was really what we see in the Romans, especially later, it was dual purpose. It was not only for hunting, but also if you wanted to get rid of somebody, it was a really easy way to do that. Dual purpose, feed your lion, get rid of somebody, nobody knows what happened to them, good to go. And so that's the idea here. No one wants to be eaten by a lion. Okay? And so it's kind of an extreme example. And so Darius is like, yeah, no one's gonna everyone's just gonna go along with this for 30 days. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to actually have to throw anybody into the lion's den. It says in verse 10, when Daniel, though, knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. As soon as he hears what happened? Okay, Daniel is just under the king, so obviously he knows what's going out before any letter is sent. And so as soon as he finds out, what does he do? He goes and prays. That's the first thing that he does. He prays just like he did every day before. And it said, verse 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. So what Daniel's doing here, and some other translations say something a little different, but essentially, he's not only praising and worshiping God here, but he's also asking God for help. Because he doesn't know what to do in this situation. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles, and then we have a nice little jab, a little prejudiced jab at Daniel, of Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now what's interesting about this and what you can miss is that Daniel probably wasn't on his 3rd prayer. He was probably on his 1st prayer. So I don't know about you, if I was trying to slip somebody up, I ain't taking no chances. I'm going in there, I'm busting out the door, I'm grabbing the fool while he's praying and bringing him to the king. But what's amazing about this is that they knew that Daniel prayed 3 times a day privately. They knew that that was his character. Even his enemies recognized Daniel's faithfulness, his discipline, his devotion to God. So they bust down his door, grab him, bring him before the king, said, remember when you wrote that like 5 minutes ago? We already got one. So they bring him in there. And he says, then the king, when he heard these words, was very much distressed, and had set on his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, O king, that this is the law of the Medes and the Persians, and no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Remember that. You got to do it. You can't get out of it. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared, O Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. There ain't nothing I can do for you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. And so what we see is typically how these dens would be set up is you'd have a hole in the top where you could drop down the food and everything else, or people in this instance. And then you had a gate in the front where you could load in and load out your lions. And so they drop Daniel down to this hole. They seal up the gate. No one can let Daniel out. It's done. It says, then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and fled from him. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad, commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. No kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, this is the part they don't read you in Sunday school. Okay, sorry. Were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. I also think like they tossed Daniel down there like as a 70-year-old man they just chucked down a hole. Okay? And then they throw these people down here who sought to destroy Daniel. Now their family lines are wiped out. They have no remembrance, no inheritance. It's all gone. It says, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, and the reign, which is the following king here, Cyrus the Persian. Because Daniel, this is the key here, because Daniel trusted in his God, he was taken up out of the den, and no harm was done to him. As someone who grew up in a Christian home, who attended church the majority of their life, the story of Daniel in the lion's den was a commonly told tale throughout my childhood. Doesn't matter if you're 8 or 80, hearing a story about an elderly man being thrown down into a pit of lions, and then is miraculously saved by a heavenly messenger is pretty fascinating. It's exciting, it's unique, it contains elements of faith and divine power, and best of all, it has animals. Making it a very attractive story to be shared by children's ministers and teachers everywhere. Outside of messages from the Gospels, the stories I remember being taught the most as a kid were Noah's Ark, Jonah and the great fish, and Daniel in the lion's den, all animal-related narratives that would end with a message about obedience. My teachers would say something like, Noah obeyed God, and so he and his family were saved from the flood. When he finally chose to obey God, Jonah was delivered from the belly of the fish. And the mouths of the lions were kept shut because Daniel obeyed God even when the king said otherwise. The first two are right, but the third is wrong. The first two are right, but the third is wrong. Not that the story of Daniel doesn't contain elements of obedience, but that's not why the mouths of the lions are shut. God didn't send an angel to protect Daniel because of his obedience, but because of trust found in prayer. Literally every aspect of this story finds its roots in prayer. Prayer is what this passage is all about. When Daniel's rivals sought to frame him and malign his character against the king, they attacked his prayer life. The order Darius signed was in regards to prayer, saying, whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except me, shall be cast into the den of lions. When Daniel heard the news, his only response was to get on his knees and pray as he had always done. And in the midst of the lions den, it's safe to say his praying continued, as it was his trust in God, whether before the king, in his chamber, or in the den, that delivered him from certain death. It wasn't obedience. It was reliance. It wasn't obedience. It was reliance. It was prayer that caused Daniel to be blessed, secured, and rescued throughout his life. He was a man of prayer who understood his need for the power and importance of taking time to talk with God. Daniel's example is incredible, isn't it? It's incredible. Not only is he disciplined enough to set aside 3 times a day to pray, to ask for petitions and praise to be lifted up, but when prayer is outlawed for 30 days with a penalty of being fed to a lion, Daniel's first and only response is to pray. One commentator put it this way: when Daniel heard the law was signed, there was no other course open to him but to pray. He went to his house deliberately and with the purpose of making one, perhaps the last bold confession to his God, who throughout his life had remarkably safeguarded him against all harm and danger. Instead of trusting in himself, he chose to continue trusting in God. And what makes this even more amazing is that Daniel's praying wasn't out of spite. It wasn't out of stubbornness. It wasn't out of habit, but out of devotion and love for his God. Prayer meant everything to Daniel. It meant so much to him that he was willing to give his life for it in a horrific way. How easy would it have been for Daniel to keep silent? The law was only set in motion for 30 days. He could have taken a break from praying. He could have prayed in secret. That's what most, if not all of us, would have done. Especially knowing it was a decree made by enemies, hoping to dispose of us. But no, Daniel goes right into his chamber, opens his windows, looks in the direction of Jerusalem, which is presently destroyed and in ruin, and hopes of his restoration, and hopes of his return. He falls down on his knees and begins thanking God, asking him for help, until his prayers are disrupted by the presence of his enemies. He's dragged out of his room. He's brought before the king, sentenced to death, thrown down a pit, sealed in darkness, filled with lions. Yet because of his prayers, his trust in God, an angel is sent to protect Daniel until Darius returns with a ladder, a rope, or something, that he might climb out the next morning. Church, if prayer is able, and I want you to hear me when I say this, if prayer is able to shut the mouths of lions and bring an angel down from heaven, why aren't we praying? Can God not do this and so much more when we trust him through prayer? When Daniel was tossed into the den, it's not that he started swinging. He didn't attempt to wrangle a lion or fight against them. In his room, he asked God for help, and it was time to trust him. How foolish would it have been for a 70-year-old man to take on a bunch of lions in the dark? It's not that the angel showed up and Daniel said, "Don't worry, buddy, I got it." I think we can all agree it would be pretty stupid to attempt to take on one lion, much less a whole den full. Yet this is what we do every day we live without prayer. We might not be in a literal lion's den. Okay, I hope not. I hope none of us experience that. But at some point we'll all find ourselves at least confronted with a lion or two. We might find ourselves in a metaphorical den. Like that Persian pit, this world is dark and dangerous, and more than anything, we need to be prayed up. There are wicked forces at work, things that are so much more powerful than we are, that will devour us unless we seek the help of God through prayer. Out of all the spiritual disciplines there are, out of all the ones that we're going to talk about, prayer is the greatest, yes, yet most neglected to our own detriment. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would look like, how they would be different, what difficulties or hurt we could have avoided had we just prayed and trusted in those prayers. Stop trying to take on lions by yourself. Stop trusting in your own power, and like Daniel, start trusting the Lord's through prayer. I know it can seem intimidating or even challenging, but prayer is a simple process. Remember, what did I tell you to write down? It's literally time talking with God. Don't make it more complicated than it has to be. Set aside some time to just be quiet. Just open up your heart and tell him what's on it. He already knows what's there anyways. He's literally sitting there waiting for you to bring it up. So just do it. I feel like the church has done a huge disservice. I'm talking about the universal church. I'm talking about the church I grew up in as well. A huge disservice when it comes to prayer, because For some reason, we teach it's got to be in this order, in this process, and at this time, and in this way. And you can only talk about certain things to God, and you can't talk to Him about other things. We have all these barriers and stipulations that are just ridiculous. He literally wants you. That's why you exist. He wants you. He wants a relationship with you, and He's waiting for you to respond to Him. Don't make it more complicated than it has to be. Of course, realize who you're talking to with reverence, but I mean, come on. It's not like what you've done is so unbearable for Him to perceive. Because He already knows anyways. There's no surprising Him. But so if you've never prayed before, I don't want you to feel any kind of shame at all, okay? I just want you to start doing it. Just give it a try, okay? If you find difficulties in remembering to pray, because that's the other one that I hear all the time, I just always forget, okay? That is a real thing. Okay? It happens. With everything else going on in the world, sometimes it's easy to get distracted and lose focus. But this is something that will help you. And people have been doing it forever. It's pairing prayer with something you already do. Most commonly, that's around a meal. Okay? I'm asking you to start there. You can pray during a meal, on your way to work, before you go to bed. Literally think of anything that you do every day that you don't even think about, that you're just going through the motions, and attach prayer to that. You're already going to do those other things. You might as well do something that's even more important than that with it. Start small and work up to Daniel. Okay? Start small and work up to Daniel. Because Daniel is a model of true devotion and spiritual discipline. He is a model of a man who lives his life for prayer. If prayer is something, though, that you're already sitting there is like, I got this. I don't just pray during meals. I pray on my own, too. Okay? That's not the attitude to have. And with that, I want you to know that if you are praying on a regular basis, you need to be intentional about what you're asking. You need to make sure that your praying is intentional. Pray deliberately. Because that's what we see with Daniel. Pray deliberately. Pray specifically. Daniel was praying about very specific things in a very deliberate way. And on top of that, in faith, he trusted God will answer. And that's the huge thing right there. I believe the labor of prayer will produce fruit beyond expectation in our lives in this church. We'll have everything that we need and be equipped to bless others to the glory of God. We'll be the people we should have always been. Say it again. We need to take time to talk to God. Let's set aside some time to be in His presence today, this week, and into the future. Let's talk to Him because we need to pray. Would you bow with me? Father, how marvelous and how wonderful are you that you love us so much that you even care to listen to what we have to say. It wasn't enough that you created us, God, but your love transcended that creation into a desire to have a relationship with us. And God, we know that relationships cannot function apart from conversation. Communication is key. We understand that a lot of times in our places of work and with friends and family, but I feel sometimes we neglect that with you. I think sometimes we assume that because you know everything, you don't need to hear from us. Maybe it is that maybe you don't need to, but more importantly, you want to. And that should mean all the more to us. God, forgive us where we have fallen short in this area. And help us, Father, to pray, to start small and work our way to the devotion that Daniel expressed before Darius, before the lions. In Jesus' name we do pray all these things. Amen.